2, 1. Well, good evening, everyone. It is great to be back once again. My name is Tommy Lee. I am the president of Resource Global, executive director of the Growth Center, and it is my honor once again to have a wonderful discussion. I'm looking forward to it with my dear friend Bob Dahl and a new friend who I am just meeting for the first time, Mr. Peter Wehner. Good evening to both of you guys, gentlemen.
Thank you, Tommy.
Hey, Tommy, thanks for having me on.
Just a little background, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Peter wrote this wonderful article in the Atlantic, is the Evangelical Church is breaking apart. Christians must reclaim Jesus from his church. One of the things over at both the Resource Global and the Growth Center Network, and here's what I wrote to everyone in preparation. I said, hosted by Resource Global and the Growth Center, our position is not to endorse any one political side or viewpoint. That's never what we want to do, but rather as advocates for building godly leaders who address local and global challenges. We strive to bring interesting conversations, and this is what today is about, and issues to light through healthy dialogue and discussions. One of the things that my dear friend and host, Bob Dahl, you've always taught me, Bob, is how do you begin to really dialogue with different people who are the same with you, but also different as you. And as Christ followers, how do we do that in a professional manner? And so, and today, Bob, who is the Chief Investment Officer for Crossmark Global. Bob, I don't have to read your bio because everyone knows who you are these days because everyone's so familiar with you and how you're always on part of our networks. Bob, thank you for coming and thank you for moderating this conversation with Peter today. And so for some of you guys who are watching, Bob and Peter are going to talk for about 45 minutes. And then from that point on, you have a chance to also ask me your questions, whether it's through the chat on both YouTube and Facebook, and also my email or text, whatever it is. Please give me your questions. And for the last 15, 20 minutes, Bob will be answering, doing some Q&A and listening to you guys as well too. But Bob, I'm turning over to you to have a conversation with Pete, and I'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Tommy, and good evening, everybody. If you're here in the U.S., if you're not, good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever's appropriate. It is my privilege to introduce Pete Wehner for our conversation this evening. Pete is a writer and editor, and he's done so for a long list of publications, including currently the New York Times and the Atlantic magazine, but also Wall Street Journal, National Review, Christianity Today, among others. Pete is a frequent commentator on a variety of television and other media networks. You've probably seen him from time to time. He served in the Reagan and first Bush administrations and became deputy director of speechwriting for President George W. Bush. He's provided counsel on domestic and international issues and served as advisor to several presidential campaigns. He's written a variety of books and dozens of articles. He's currently a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. As Tommy mentioned, what spurred this interview was the article written by Pete that appeared last month in the Atlantic magazine entitled "The Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart," subtitle "Christians Must Reclaim Jesus from His Church." And to repeat what Tommy hinted at, this is not a conversation about politics, even though we'll probably have to go there for some of the background for this article. It's about the church and we Christians and our need and I hope desire to reclaim Jesus. So Pete, welcome. Glad you could do this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I'm looking forward to the conversation and with you and with the people later during the Q&A. And
great.
So it's great to be with you.
Super. Well, before we get started, tell us a little bit more. I just kind of read the bio, a little bit more about your career and maybe an experience or two that shaped your views over the years, Pete.
Sure. Just a very quick bio on me. I mean, I was born in Dallas, grew up in Washington State, east side of the state, went to school in Seattle, University of Washington, political science, did a couple of internships. One was in Olympia when I was a junior. And then when I was a senior, I did an internship that brought me out to DC. And basically, I never left. I got a series of jobs in think tanks. Then this is in the 1980s. I was actually at Ethics and Public Policy Center in the 80s. Then I went to work. My first foray into government was I was a young, mid-20-year-old speechwriter for William Bennett, who was then Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. And then when George H.W. Bush became president, Bill was the so-called drug czar. So I was both a writer and was an aide de camp to him. And then I was policy director at a think tank called Empower America in the 90s, which was Jack Kemp, Bill Bennett, Gene Kirkpatrick, Vin Weber. And then I became deputy director of speechwriting for President Bush, did that for 2 years. And then I was director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, which is a kind of in-house White House think tank until 2007. And then I rejoined the Ethics and Public Policy Center in 2007, where I've been since that time, and been writing, as you said, mostly for the New York Times and the Atlantic. Times since 2015, the Atlantic a few years after that, and really I'm allowed to write on pretty much any topics that I care about. Interestingly, when the Times brought me on, they were interested in a conservative voice, but what they didn't quite realize is that faith was sort of a package deal for me.
Yeah.
And I've written about from 12 to 15 meditations on Christ or on Christianity for the Times, not on politics and faith, though I've written plenty on that topic as well. But I'm talking about the resurrection, the incarnation, the crucifixion, grace, humility, where's God in the midst of suffering, the Jesus revolution.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
That kind of thing. So, I've been in politics more or less for my entire adult life. It was a passion of mine when I was as young as really junior high and high school. Social studies was my favorite class. I used to have debates with my professors. They were liberal. I was conservative, not because I'd really thought about it much, but my parents tended that way. So I did too. And then very quickly, my faith journey began at the end of high school, into college. Didn't really grow up in a Christian home. My oldest sister is 5 years older than I, had independently, she'd gone to University of Washington and become a Christian. So when I began my pilgrimage of faith, which was really one based on questions and sort of intellect and history, I didn't have at least any conscious sense of feeling a need, to have faith or to find purpose in life through faith. So for me, it was really a lot of questions, and faith didn't come easily for me. So I've been by disposition and inclination, I suppose, temperament, a person who asks a lot of questions and needs to sort of forge my journey through the reading, through relationships, through conversations, but had plenty of really important, wise, caring, loving people throughout that Christian journey. In terms of an episode, just one that stands out to me was actually I was in the White House the morning of September 11th, 2001. Usually Mike Gerson, who was the senior speechwriter, went to the senior staff meetings, but that morning he was at home working on a communities of character speech, because we had gotten through two of the main elements of our agenda on education and economics and taxes. So we were thinking through and struggling a little bit with what the fall thematic would be. And so Mike was working on the speech, Communities of Character, which echoed what George W. Bush had said in his first inaugural. And senior staff meetings at 7:30 was for us in any event, usually hosted by the chief of staff if he's there, or the deputy chief of staff if he was gone. And then you had representatives from various offices, the vice president's office, legislative affairs, communications, press department, speech writing, and so forth. And so I remember thinking as I was sitting there that this was one of the most uneventful days of the Bush presidency. He had gone down to Sarasota the night before. He was doing an education event.
He was in a classroom, right?
He was in a classroom, right? And so the topic of the conversation during the senior staff meeting was in part on a congressional barbecue that we were supposed to host on the South Lawn that day. And when I would always write Mike emails after the senior staff meeting to recapitulate what we had discussed. And my first sentence to him on September 11th was, "Nothing much is going on today." And I sent that precisely 5 minutes before the first trade tower hit. Then 17 minutes, the second one hit. Then you had the Pentagon hit and Flight 93 in Pennsylvania go down. And of course, the world changed from there. So it was a reminder of the vicissitudes of life, and how certainly things changed for us.
Thanks for sharing all that fascinating background. Thanks especially for the faith journey. You're the kind of guy I'd like to have a 4-hour dinner with. I have so many questions. But let's move on to the article. The Evangelical Church is breaking apart. What prompted you to write this article, Pete?
It's just something on my mind. I mean, my articles and essays are usually just things that come into my heart or mind, something that interests me. And I just had this sense that there were a lot of fractiousness that's defining much of the white evangelical church. And I'm friends with a lot of pastors just over the years, people I've met. So I'm stay in touch with them, including people who were influential to me as long ago as high school. So I've always stayed in touch with and forged good friendships, close friendships with pastors. And I had been hearing anecdotally some of what was going on. Then there was this event at McLean Bible Church here in Northern Virginia, where David Platt had given a sermon, and it was pretty striking because he had identified what he believed to be the causes of divisions in the context of electing 3 elders, and he just named how a small group of zealous people were, in his words, trying to take over the church and were spreading misinformation, disinformation. And it was pretty striking to hear a pastor give voice to that in a sermon. So I just had a feeling that it was time to do this. And so I wrote a lot of friends of mine, pastors, theologians, seminary presidents, academics, others, people of faith, just reaching out to them, stating my thesis, which is that I thought that this was a time of unusual acrimony and division, and asking for their responses. And I got a lot of them. And what was really took me aback, even though it was my thesis going in that there were divisions, was that nobody that I heard from, and I heard from dozens and dozens and dozens of people. I think I probably ended up writing more than 60 people just in the context of researching for the article. Nobody took issue with my premise. In fact, most of what I heard were people coming in and saying, well, wait till you hear this. So that really is what came up. I mean, I have been writing in various forums on this issue of the politicization of churches, Christian evangelical churches, for a while now. But this was a real comprehensive look. And most of the essay is reporting. I mean, it's probably 80 or 85% of me telling the story through the wisdom and the insights of other people. Most of them were good enough to go on the record. A few of them, for understandable reasons, had to go off the record, or not off the record, but on background. I didn't mention them. In some cases, because they were pastors who were in the process of or thinking very seriously about or intent on leaving their churches, and they hadn't shared it with anybody except in some cases their spouse and me. So of course I kept their names private. But these were really wise and thoughtful people who were trying to tell a story, and these were people who were from within the faith and within the family. I wasn't really interested in seeking out critics of the evangelical world. These are people like Tim Keller and Mark Laverton and Alan Jacobs, and people who've worked at InterVarsity. So these are people whose lives have been defined more or less, in large part at least, by their association with and love for the evangelical movement. So I felt like I wanted to hear from people who were who were burdened by this and pained by this precisely because they love the church.
Yeah. We'll get into some of the specifics in the article, but let me create what I think is an inference and let you agree or not. And that is that discipleship, or might I say Christian maturity, or the lack thereof, is a serious crisis in the 21st century church. And a parallel is kind of the loss of the practice of servant leadership. Is that behind the scenes in much of what you were writing, or am I reading too much into it?
No, I think that's a fair assumption. I mean, I think there is a loss of servant leadership. I imagine that's always a challenge because servant leadership is a rare quality, and one that's, it's an interesting thing, and in some ways I suppose it has an almost inherent contradiction, which is often people who are drawn to leadership aren't drawn to servant leadership. I mean, they have certain qualities. I'm not even saying this negatively or positively, but a certain drive and ambition to lead. That's often why they're leaders themselves. And so this quality, which really was obviously embodied supremely in Jesus, of servant leadership, is a rare thing, because often those very impulses that move people to lead argue against servanthood. It's a phrase that is used often. I think it's used far more often than it's embodied in people. And I do think it's a Christian maturity. What you say. I mean, I put it in maybe a slightly different way, which is, I think what I found in this writing, or I didn't find it, but I think what was underscored so vividly to me was how central sociology, culture, political orientation, partisanship is to people of the Christian faith. Though these people would say, and if you gave them sodium pentothal, they would certainly pass if it was a lie detector test. They would say that the thing that they care most about, their first love, is Christ and allegiance to Christ, and everything else is secondary to that, particularly politics, cultural war issues, and so forth. I think in practice, it's a lot more mixed than that. And I think what I found and what I'm hearing from people is, in a lot of cases, the core identity of Christians is really not Christ. It's sociology, it's political orientation, it's cultural war issues. And people engage in something we all battle with, which is confirmation bias, motivated reasoning. And so people proof text the Bible to support what they are inclined already to believe, and what they're inclined to believe already hasn't been shaped. Their sensibilities haven't been shaped so much by Scripture as it's been shaped by this kind of sociology and culture. And that's, by the way, that, Bob, I think that's one of the reasons why there's such an intensity to some of these debates and differences. Sometimes if you have a conversation with somebody and there's a particular energy behind it, and you think, kind of, what's going on here? This is just a disagreement over an issue. And what you discover, I think, is it's not actually the issue itself. That's a shadow boxing match. The shadow is the issue, but in fact, what you're actually really talking about, and what creates the energy, the antipathy, is a sense of a core identity is under attack. So when there are debates about issues, it's not the issue per se, it's that these issues become proxies for who these people are on a very deep level. And anytime any of us feel it's like our core identity is under attack, the tendency we have, the natural human impulse, is to strike back and to lash back and to protect. And so I think that is what's happening. I think that where a lot of us are sleepwalking a little bit, and our first love is not Jesus in the way that we think it is, than that we wish it were, and the way we tell ourselves that it is.
So as a result, are you finding, as you think about the past, Christians today more committed to their political parties and their candidates than they used to be? And if so, why? Is that because this has become more important and Jesus and his words become less important? What do you read into this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think this has existed for a long time. Actually, if you go through just even American history, the confluence of Christianity and politics has existed probably almost forever.
Yeah.
Interestingly, to the degree that the early Christian church spread so rapidly in the first 2 centuries, Rodney Stark has written about this, so have others. It wasn't at all because of any affiliation or political power or cultural power, because at that point Christians were on the cultural margins. They had no political influence to speak of. Jesus didn't lead a political movement. His disciples weren't political leaders. It was what Stark refers to as a community of care. It was the idea that the Christian community were reaching out to the dispossessed, those on the margins of society, women in a society that was deeply misogynistic and patriarchal, taking in orphans and widows, helping the wounded and the sick. So there was a real sacrifice, a real selflessness that defined Christianity, and that's part of the reason, maybe one of the main reasons, that it grew so much. But then you get to Constantine and the wedding of Christianity and the state, and I mean, the whole history is just not very good, honestly. When the state gets too aligned with political power, you saw this with the German church in the 1930s. I mean, why is Bonhoeffer a hero? It was because he stood almost alone, not entirely alone, but almost alone against that. Or Rwanda, right? When they had those awful massacres, Tutsis and the Hutus, the Rwanda was more than 90% Christian. Or you go and read Mark Knoll's book on the Civil War's theological crisis. The South, almost to a person, read the Bible. There were verses, they proof text, slaves obey your master. Peter and Paul wrote those words, and they said, well, there you go. Slavery is justified in the Bible. How can you argue to overthrow it? And the abolitionist movement, of course, had a different view of human dignity and a kind of, I suppose, redemptive hermeneutic. If you're a William Webb and Tremper Longman, that would be their explanation. But so this has gone on for a long time. There's an interesting book that came out, The Bible Told Us So. It profiles churches in South Carolina during the civil rights struggle, and how, again, the Bible was used to defend certain views, in this case, segregation. So that's always happened, but I think it's more pronounced now, and I think it's more pronounced now for a variety of reasons. I think Donald Trump was a big factor there. I think social media is a huge factor. I think it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of social media in terms of what I was told by a number of people in the essay that I wrote, Alan Jacobs, and James Ernst, who's a publisher of Christian books, and they talked about catechism, and basically a feedback loop of social media. And the point, just to simplify it, is that if you're a pastor, and you have somebody in your church, they might be there, if you're lucky, every Sunday for a 25-minute sermon in a worship service, maybe an adult education class for 45 minutes, and then more rare still, a Bible study or home group every other week, versus 25 hours a week of a constant feedback of whatever your favorite website, cable news station, talk radio station is. That's going on and on and on, reinforcing these beliefs and doing it in a way that creates agitation and fear and combat. And we're under attack and we're under assault and we have to protect ourselves. And this is a fight to the struggle. This is a cage match. And if that's what you're hearing all the time, that will create certain sensibilities. And then people begin to fit scripture into that. And it's sort of preposterous in a way if you think about that as the Jesus ethic, or the Jesus way, as Eugene Peterson referred to it. But I think that's where we've gotten. Plus, it's always been a tricky balance about faith and politics, because you could be on both extremes, which is full immersion, or faith and politics never intersect. Most of us, certainly I, am not in either of those camps. My view is that because politics is finally and fundamentally about justice, imperfect justice, but justice always matters. The Bible speaks a lot about justice, and there are certain moments in the life of a history or a country, certain movements, where Christians, for the sake of the moral good and the common good, for human dignity, human flourishing, probably need to speak out. That would be the Bonhoeffer example. But how to do that, and how not to become fully immersed in politics, how not to become partisan. Martin Luther King Jr. said the church shouldn't be the servant or the master of the state, it should be the conscience of the state. And that always implied a certain distance from the state, and certainly a distance from political parties and partisanship. And so the idea was that the church would remain sort of pure and anchored and centered in its beliefs, and therefore be able to speak to these moments with a certain kind of moral integrity. And I think a lot of that's been lost, unfortunately, and at a huge cost, including, I think, to the younger generation who are just fleeing the churches because they think this is a charade, a moral freak show.
Good but sad analysis. You wrote in the last couple of years a bunch about the Trump administration, the election, and so on. Some argue on both sides of the aisle, as you know better than me, that Mr. Trump's narcissism, lack of empathy, some people would say, and sometimes misrepresentations led to the election of Joe Biden. Do you think that decency, honor, respect, empathy were on the ballot in some way? And is that a lot of the reason Joe Biden got elected, do you think?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, I mean, there was what social scientists refer to as the exhausted majority. And those were people who, the kind of relentlessness and intensity of the Trump years, and for what a lot of people, not all people by any means, but a lot of people, probably a majority of Americans, felt like was kind of crudity and cruelty in terms of his style of politics and his manner of discourse, and just the way he conducted himself, that they found it not just off-putting, but grinding, because of the sheer intensity of the political debates and the hatred that seemed to permeate in ways that had never happened before, at least in our lifetime. You may have experienced this, certainly in conversations that I've had with people. There's a kind of intensity and anger and sensitivity that experience a lot of families. I've heard from countless number of people, families have split up on this, or at a minimum, Thanksgiving dinners are uncomfortable, or certain issues are put off limits. So in my estimation, obviously there are a lot of people who are wise and honorable who disagree with me, but in my estimation, Donald Trump kind of was a supercharged effect, accelerated a lot of these worrisome tendencies. He didn't invent them; they existed before him. And of course, politics has always been involved passionate debates, and that's fine and understandable. These are important issues. People have strong opinions, and when you have strong opinions and disagreements, you get into arguments. It's just that it's in I think a different order of magnitude in terms of the antipathy that versus what we've seen before.
Along these lines, there are some that say, what he said or tweeted doesn't matter. It's what he did. The whole ends justifying the means.
Yeah.
And that's become, or was and still is to some degree, a debate. Is that one of the issues that the Evangelical Church in this breakup period has to stand up for? I mean, isn't it a reputational risk for the church?
Oh, I think so. I've written about that. I should say I've always understood the argument that people made in 2016. I think it was a little less persuasive by the time we got to 2020, but certainly in 2016, where they said, "Look, Donald, we're electing a president, not a pastor. he's imperfect. He's not a model for my kids. But what I'm electing him for is because I agree with him in terms of his court appointments and abortion and his tax policies and, go on right down the line. And so they say, well, look, we're going to weigh those things. And we think that the advantages we get with the Trump administration and Trump presidency on policy outweighs the other things that may happen. I mean, that's a reasonable argument. I didn't agree with it. But it makes sense. I think what honestly troubled me the most was that I felt like once a lot of evangelicals made common cause with Donald Trump, they completely lost their objectivity and they began to defend him, including in things that were indefensible. And I've heard this said time and time again. It was like, well, so he sends out a tweet that's that's a little rough around the edges, or that's a little bit incivil, but why is that a big deal? And my view is just very different. I mean, he was impeached twice, I think, on legitimate grounds. We saw what happened. He's spreading what I think is an absolutely insidious lie about the election. There's just no basis in fact for it to say it was stolen. This is acid in a democracy, because if democracies function in large part on unstated but accepted propositions, such as the peaceful transfer of power, and if you lose, you bow out. And now, when somebody comes in and says this election didn't happen, or the January 6th attack on the Capitol and the insurrection was actually not a problem, and it was the November 3rd vote, which was the actual insurrection. I mean, that's dynamite in a democracy, and it's more than just an unfortunate tweet. It's much more serious than that. I mean, I don't want to relitigate the entire Trump presidency. What bothered me was that people that I felt like should have stood up and been able to say, look, we agree with the court appointments and we agree with the stand on abortion. At the same time, we have to speak truth to power. We have to have integrity. And so when President Trump did this or said that or acted in this manner, we simply have to say that by our lights is not acceptable as people of the Christian faith. What happened is that I think a lot of them got into a mindset that said, we're in this existential struggle. This is tribalistic politics. He's the head of our tribe, the quarterback of our team, and we have to protect him at all costs. And we're in a period where both sides are afflicted by something called affective polarization. And essentially what that means is that the hatred that you have for the other side is deeper than the loyalty that you have even to your own side. And so that for a lot of people, including in my experience, a lot of evangelical Christians, they wanted to so-called own the libs. Anything that would have given satisfaction to liberals or Democrats, here we're talking about conservative evangelicals, of course, they wouldn't want to do by definition. And so I think that was a problem. The left struggles with these as well. It's just that when we're talking about the white evangelical church in America, the left is really not that much of a force or a factor in it. The overwhelming number of white evangelicals are Republicans. 80% voted for Trump. So that's just a reality that we have to accept. If it were the flip side, if the left were doing this, I would say the same thing. I was a very vocal critic of Bill Clinton in the 1990s. I haven't changed a millimeter from the arguments that I made at that time. I think it's a lot of other people who bashed Bill Clinton with a moral 2x4 in 1998. 1999, who then, when Donald Trump came around, said, morality really doesn't matter. That I think that those are the people who have shifted, and I think that's pretty obvious. I think it's a damning indictment.
Thank you for sharing all that. Let me get personal for a second. Your principles have been consistent throughout. And given your what you've done, I work for Republican administrations. It's no secret who you are, and yet you've been appropriately, as a Christian, critical of some of the behavior that you just discussed. Have you received a lot of criticism, and how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, some. I mean, because, my world was really primarily a Republican world. I mean, that's
Yeah.
working in 3 administrations and Republican White House. And a lot of my friendships were based on that. And I've had friends where I've literally stayed up until 3:30 in the morning on several occasions with them. Very close friends, people I've known for many, many years, really grieved by my stand. They're feeling like I'm borderline doing the work of Satan. And I don't say that to be hyperbolic. I think their view is that I'm criticizing the Evangelical Church, the bride of Christ, and I'm basically giving ammunition to secularists by portraying the Evangelical Church. And if I did it once, that would be fine, but I do it too often. And then there are, of course, people in the Republican Party where their loyalty is for the party. Mine has never been actually that deep to the party. I was always, for me, I mean, being a Christian was the most important thing. Then I was a conservative more than I was a Republican. For me, the Republican Party was mostly an instrument to advance certain ideas or principles, political theory, political philosophy that I had. Conservatism, I don't consider the Republican Party today to be a conservative party. I consider it to be a populist party, a certain kind of dangerous sort of mob mentality, and sort of ethnic nationalist elements are running through it. So it's just, it's not a party that I'm comfortable in, quite apart from the defenses of things that I think are indefensible. But honestly, I don't, it wasn't. I mean, I certainly have paid a cost in several ways. There's no question about that. But, if you had asked me to name the 20 or 25 people in my life before Donald Trump ever got onto the political stage, whom I admired the most and whose opinion mattered most to me and who I felt knew me the most, whether you're talking about pastors, people from college, my siblings, my parents before they passed away, teachers, others, I think almost to a person, they wouldn't be surprised that I came out where I did on this, just knowing who I was and how I was put together. And I think most of them, in fact, I'm quite confident that almost all of them would have been disappointed if I have come out any other position. And most of all, I would have been disappointed in myself. I may be wrong, obviously, in my critique. There are a lot of people who would say so. But these views come very authentically to me. And I've had a lot of debates about it. I haven't been persuaded that I'm wrong in my critique. And actually, I think that as the Trump presidency rolled on, particularly since the election, I think my concerns have been validated, not refuted. But there are certainly worse things in life than not being part of a tribe. And I also think, as I was saying, even in my faith journey, I think just temperamentally and dispositionally, that's not like essential to me to feel like I'm part of a home team. I do have friends, writers, public intellectuals, and others, pastors, theologians, whom I'm very close to, who I'm in contact with, and most of them I think are comfortable with where I've come out, and I think that helps. If I were really stranded and alone in that, I'm sure it'd be harder.
Yep. No question. Let's come back to the subject of polarization. It's been building for some time, and as you've argued both tonight and in your writings, it's accelerated. The defeat of the middle. You're primaried from either side if you're a moderate, and as you said, the dialogue, the vitriol. Almost a hate for the other side rather than just agreeing to disagree. I know you're a writer and observer, but I'm going to ask the question, what's the solution? What's the role of the church in this? How do we deflect some of these things so that we can get back to what the church is really about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll be interested in some of the people when they join in and on what their thoughts are. I'm guessing that they'll have better thoughts than I. I mean, I'd say several things. I mean, the first thing I would say is, for the physician's code, which is first do no harm. I think if the church ceased being a contributing factor and accelerant to the worst tendencies in American politics and the hatred and division, that wouldn't be a bad place to start, because I think churches are driving a lot of this and making it worse. That's really what my essay, in some respects, was about, which is how much these political differences were entering into the body of Christ and created tremendous difficulties for pastors who have no interest in arbitrating this. I mean, they became pastors because they want to be shepherds. They want to preach about Matthew 5 or Philippians 2. They want to minister to people's lives. They want to help people through grief and in healing. They don't want to be virologists in an intense debate about masks, and social distancing or critical race theory or the politics of Donald Trump. They just don't want that. And that, by the way, I don't think it's dominant in evangelical churches, at least according to the pastor I've talked to. In many cases, just a small group of people who are particularly zealous. And as one pastor said to me, they're a special kind of relentless, but it doesn't take many of them to upset the equilibrium of a church and to
on both sides.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. No, this is not limited to one side. And some people want pastors to preach, after George Floyd was killed on a more sort of progressive element about taking to the streets, and other people want abortion. So I mean, there are people who have all sorts of strong opinions on politics who feel that pastors should weigh in, and pastors, for the most part that I know, just don't feel like that's their calling or even their expertise. Like, why would I have a special? What they can do from time to time, as you know, is to give a critique on certain moral issues, or to speak what the Bible may say about the stranger and the sojourner. But that still doesn't tell you what your specific immigration policy should be.
Right. Or should I wear a mask or not? Right.
Right. Exactly. So the first thing I'd say is do no harm. I mean, beyond that, what should churches do? That if they were able to model grace and understanding, and as Scott Dudley, who's a minister, senior pastor at Bellevue Presbyterian Church, said, the Bible models how to disagree too, and there are appropriate ways. No one is asking, or shouldn't ask, that we push aside our disagreements. That's unreasonable, and it's not going to happen in any event. What we have to do is to be able to model how you disagree within the context and parameters of a certain degree of respect and civility. I think we need to model listening well to one another, listening to one another's stories, asking questions about why people have the views that they have. To the extent that I've had good conversations with people who are very strongly pro-Trump or have very strong disagreements with me, they've mostly been because I've tried to listen to their life, to connect with them in areas other than politics, and to take a genuine interest in other areas of their life. And then I think the defensiveness and the shield and the swords kind of go down, and then you can begin to have conversations and a trust develops. You're not going to outshout or out argue or out empirical data people. That's just not how we operate. The stronger your argument, if you're relentless in making it, the more likely the other side is to dig in their heels and to say no. Then there's this catechesis. I think churches need to be very intentional. This is a longer term project about how to think through what's the biblical model for public theology, Christians to engage in culture and politics. So I think that kind of thing can happen, and leadership. I mean, there's no substitute for leadership, but even good leadership can find us. But in the end, it's a rather simple answer, but it is that I think people's affections, the order of their loves, need to be changed, and the affections of their heart need to be won to Christ, and that core identity we started the conversation with. I think if Christ were more core to who we are, if his presence were to more integrated in our lives, we would just react differently than we do. I've used an analogy, Bob, before, which is if you came to me and said, look, I'm pretty badly overweight, I need to lose 40 pounds. And I said, okay, I think I have some ideas for you. And said, but before doing that, let me stipulate that I don't want to exercise more, and I don't want to eat less, and I don't want to eat differently. Now tell me how to lose 40 pounds. It's like, it's a little harder that way. If you've got members of a church whose hearts aren't taken up by Christ, and then the question becomes, how can we be more Christ-like in our attitude? How can we model more grace, more forgiveness, more generosity of spirit? If that's not done, then we have nothing to teach the world, nothing to show the world, nothing that's different. We have the same impulses that they do, the same reflexes to anger, the same partisan, passions, the same roll of the eyes. How can they think this? Why do they say that? Why do they have to be so judgmental? Don't they see the evil they're doing? We all have that. And you need something to have a greater force in our life. For Christians, theoretically, it would be the fruits of the Spirit and the Holy Spirit and Christ.
Preach it, my friend. You gave a great answer. You did give solutions. It points back to Jesus. It really does. A lot of good questions coming in. COVID, you brought it up a minute ago. COVID obviously put stresses and strains in lots of ways to particular churches and the church in general, kept us from worshiping together, from generally being in community. How much of that is causing some of the fracturing that we're talking about? I'm not talking about the disagreements around masks, et cetera, but just the COVID consequences. How do you react to that?
Yeah, I think it was a big deal. And actually, I mentioned that in the essay, and several of the pastors that I talked to mentioned it as well. I think you had a kind of perfect storm of issues come up, the racial issues, the 2020 election, but COVID was a really big deal. Obviously, everybody on the planet was affected by COVID. I think it hit churches particularly hard for the reasons you mentioned, Bob, which is there's a sense of community and the corporate worship, baptism, communion, the Bible studies, the adult education classes, all of those things together are extremely important. And when you lose that kind of human connection, that kind of corporate unity or corporate connection, I think that really hurt the church and made it more vulnerable to the issues that came up. Now, these fractures and these divisions were in motion long before COVID appeared or hit us, but I think it was an issue in which probably to use, I guess, the analogy, our antibodies were weak, and then you had COVID hit, and I just think that made everything worse.
A lot of, as you can guess, a lot of political questions. I'm just going to give you two. If you want to give short answers, that's fine.
Sure.
One is you have said in the past that Biden's not a particularly strong strategic thinker. How do you think he's doing as president? And the other, from the other side, is do you expect former President Trump to run for re-election? Take it as you might.
Yeah. Well, I'll take them in reverse order. Do I think Trump will run for re-election? I think he wants to run for re-election, and I think the fact that Joe Biden's poll numbers are quite low and Republicans are quite likely to do very well in the midterms will probably encourage him to do it. So I think he's thinking that he's going to do it, and I think most Republicans are thinking he's going to do it. And if he runs, he's obviously going to be the heavy favorite, overwhelming favorite to win the nomination. But as John Adams said, life is a theater of vicissitudes, and a lot can change, and a lot could be health related. It could be indictments. He's got some pretty serious cases that he's facing, legal challenges too, and he's also emotionally not the most stable person that we've ever had as president. He's very volatile. And these things can kind of shift. But I think if you were betting right now, you probably would bet that he's he's going to run, and if he was going to run, you'd have to bet at this point that he would get the nomination. Now that's different than if he would win. In terms of Biden, how is he doing as president? I mean, if you go by public approval, disapproval, and that's not everything for sure, but he's not doing well. I mean, he's really sunk in the polls. He's had some struggles. I think several things have happened. He just signed the infrastructure bill, which presumably will help him some. But Democratic Party's been divided. They hadn't really produced much until now. The way that the Afghanistan withdrawal was handled was, I think, by any metric, any standard, very poorly handled. And it wasn't just that issue per se, because a lot of people, the majority of the country, wanted us to withdraw troops. But I think the way it was done, and the human, some of those images played into something which I think is dangerous for Joe Biden, which is a sense that he's not nearly as competent as we thought he would be. He was hired in part to bring normalcy back to the presidency, his experience. He's been in Congress forever, and he promised to heal the soul of the nation. And on the competence front, people feel like, look, COVID, it's been fits and starts, and while I think he's handled COVID better than Donald Trump in very important respects, although not because of Trump, but during Trump's watch, you of course had this medical miracle, which was the vaccine, which people like Francis Collins at NIH and many others were responsible for. But it happened on Trump's watch, and so he gets credit for that. But the COVID situation's not gone well. The economy, inflation is as high as it's been in 30 years. Economy is always a really big issue. Gas prices are high. You've got the supply chain problem. So right now, he just seems to be in over his head. He's also I think clearly slowed down. I mean, he's 78 years old, and sometimes it shows. He seems fragile at times, and he doesn't seem fully in command. That said, I voted for Biden not because I agreed with him on policy, because I'm a conservative. I just felt like the alternative would have been a catastrophe. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I mean, I've been in politics long enough, and I could cite you many examples of presidents in their first years being low and easily winning re-election, like Bill Clinton did, and others. And then there are people like George H.W. Bush, who was skyrocketing in the public opinion polls after Desert Storm and got trounced by Bill Clinton in '92. These things change. So it's way too early to make a decisive judgment about the Biden presidency at this point.
Thanks for taking those two. I'm going to connect a question that came in with one I didn't have time to ask. In your opinion, how are younger Christians looking at politics differently from previous generations? And I add to that, how do we recover the damage done to the witness of the church from the politics, especially among millennials and Gen Z?
Yeah, boy, those are great questions, and I've spent a lot of time on that. I think the most personally painful thing for me has been exactly what the second question got to, which is the damage to the witness of the church. I think it's been just enormous, and and I think a lot of the people who were most responsible for that damage have hermetically sealed themselves off from that realization. How does it recover from it? It's just going to take time. As I said, I mean, the first thing is probably to pull the knife out of the body. You've got to quit having people coming out there and saying things that are just wrong or conspiracy laden or defending the indefensible. There's no way to do it. It's a free country. If people like Robert Jeffress or Eric Metaxas, wants to go out, or Franklin Graham, and say what they say, there's no way to stop them. I do think that we may have long ago reached a point where more responsible voices probably should have spoken up. The conversation I've had with pastors, it's complicated, honestly. because I know why pastors don't want to weigh into politics. They don't want to fracture their congregation. There's a genuine worry, which is if they say anything remotely political, on Sunday, January 12th, then when they preach on Philippians 2 on Sunday, January 19th, some number of the people who disagreed with you politically won't listen to what you say about the humility of Christ in Paul's epistle or the Sermon on the Mount, as I was referring to earlier. So I get that. I do wonder, though, at some point, the way I described it is you had a situation in which, excuse me, the Evangelical Church, I think, was not nearly as monolithic as a lot of people who are not evangelicals understood. And the reason is that you had a handful, more than a handful, but number of people who were very vocal and very public and on television and radio, creating one narrative, which I think was very destructive to the witness of the church. And then you had a lot of other people who were horrified by what was happening, and they didn't really say anything because they weren't themselves political. They didn't see their task as being political. But the net effect of that goes to the first question you asked, which is, to a watching world, they said, well, there are all these people who are claiming to be spokes individuals and either pastors or leaders of Christian organizations saying this, and nobody else except, Pete Wehner and David French and Mike Gerson, who aren't pastors, they're just commentators, are saying, oh, no, that's not really the way Christianity views it. They're going to come away and say that must represent what the evangelical movement is. And of course, it's not. But so it would have helped, I think, to have had more important, distinguished, influential voices in the evangelical world speak out. I think that a good friend of mine, Carl Kopic, who was instrumental in my own journey of faith, referred to a generational catastrophe apropos that first question. I do think to one of the reasons I have some hope for the future is I do think that the younger generation, having seen this moral freak show, have no intention of replicating it. And Gary Haugen, who's a good friend of mine and is president of the International Justice Mission, which is just a fantastic human rights organization. They're doing great work. And what Gary will tell you is that in his conversations with younger generation, justice is much more front and center to this generation than it was, a generation or two ago. Back then, he really had to put his shoulder to the wheel to argue why Christians should care about justice. That's really not the case now. So I think the younger generation, I understand why they're turned off by this. I just hope they don't tune out or that they become cynical or withdraw, because politics is too important to withdraw from. I just hope that they can, sometimes apropos, I suppose, the pandemic, viruses create their own antibodies. And having seen what's happened, I know an awful lot of younger people, really 35 and below primarily, who look at this and say, this is not what we want to be. This is not who we will be. So some of this, I think, probably is generational. Some of these older leaders need to pass from the scene, and then a younger generation will come up. How do you restore the witness of the church? You do it a life at a time, a community at a time, a soup kitchen at a time, a conversation at Starbucks at a time. We simply have to show people that Christianity, in terms of their own contact with people of the Christian faith, is very different than this narrative. I have friends of mine who are atheists, and they see a different view of Christianity through me and through friends of mine. And so it's not quite as easy for them to buy into this, this narrative of what white evangelicals are. But it's an uphill struggle right now.
I'm going to pass this back to Tommy before I do a couple of things. One, I want to read a paragraph that you wrote this past summer that gives a lot of hope. Countless people of the Christian faith lead lives of integrity. I've been on the receiving end of profound expressions of grace and generosity from people who have walked alongside me during difficult times. I've seen people who, in the words of the Apostle Paul, shine like stars in the universe. Throughout history, Christianity has made great contributions to art and literature, to acts of charity and defending human rights. The abolitionist and civil rights movements can't be understood without taking into account the role of faith. The same is true of anti-abortion movement. You express a lot of hope in that paragraph, and let's hope we have more reasons to have that hope. And I know I speak as a fellow believer, Pete, but I suspect I'm joined by many. We need to reclaim Jesus for the church. So thank you for your hour. More importantly, thank you for your voice of reason and logic, your desire for the good of the church and for our nation. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Bob. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Tommy, back to you.
Pete, Bob, can I ask you guys each one final question as we wrap up? Pete, I'm going to start off with you. Side note, General Colin Powell recently passed away. You probably had a chance to work with him. What were your reflections on the general?
Oh, he was a man of tremendous integrity and embodied human excellence and was a trailblazer as an African American first National Security Council advisor who was African American, first person who was Joint Chief of Staff, first Secretary of State. So he was a trailblazer too. But he was a person who had a North Star, a moral North Star, and he followed it. And he was an admirable man in so many ways. Could have been president in 1996, but decided, I suppose, like Cincinnati, to go to plow the field. And I think Alma had something to do with that decision too. But he'll be missed. We need more people in public service like Colin Powell. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but if you take him in the totality of his acts, he was a great man.
Pete, Bob, for you is just like Pete, you get a chance to interact with different pastors, ministry leaders in different parts, marketplace leaders who are Christians, and many of them disagree with you and are different than you. What are some advice that you, as you wrap up, how do you work with people who are different than you, who disagree with you politically, economically, spiritually, theologically?
I first want to agree with Pete on Colin Powell, a great American, a big loss. Integrity, consistency, articulate. He made mistakes, you're right, Pete, but he owned up to his mistakes more than most do, which is a mark of a real leader. To your question, Tommy, you need to listen. We need to recognize God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a lot to be said for that. And if we listen to other people and don't just constantly reload as they're talking to fire back at them, we have a chance. We just need to lower the temperature, recognize that differences are not personal. They are for the betterment of our dialogue and hopefully the betterment of our nation, and more importantly, for the betterment of the church.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And again, for those who are watching, look, our agenda is not, hey, look, these are viewpoints, pro, Republican, pro, Democrat, whatever it is, but it's topics that affect culture. And someone like Pete just really wrestle with that topic and help us understand some of the things that were going on. And Bob, I brought you on because you allow us to really be able to moderate a conversation where we have healthy dialogue, healthy debate, healthy disagreement. So gentlemen, thank you so much. I know you're both on the East Coast. It's 9 o'clock. So thank you so much and have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Tommy, for hosting, and blessings to y'all.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.